I want to start with the caveat that anybody who claims to know what's going to happen in the next 4 years is selling you something. Right? Predict the unpredictable, expect the unexpected. I even was making last-minute changes to my slides this morning in response to the memo that went out about grants that some of you probably, hopefully not, but I suspect are concerned about. But yeah, so I've been working for the last few years on trying to understand where the common ground is on climate change. And the next 4 years part comes from, I was getting a lot of media requests after the election, what's going to happen in the next 4 years? And I don't know, but it doesn't make for very good television. So anyway, so I'll put forward what I think are some educated guesses. But okay, why did I start working on this? I actually didn't really, a lot of for this part of my research, a lot of the stuff that I do methodologically almost looks like political science or psychology. Right? I was at a conference in January and someone was like, I thought you were a social psychologist. But the point is, I didn't get interested in this topic because of what I did my PhD in. I got interested in this topic because I was in environmental science, environmental studies departments for 10 years, and I kept hearing messages that to me sounded like we need to decarbonize all of society, and we can only trust the leftmost third of the Democrats to do that. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. Even if they have all their good ideas, like how are you going to decarbonize Arkansas that way, right? How are you going to decarbonize Wyoming that way, right? And so I just want to start with the observation that people are really interested in this topic. People who have been following the climate issue at times like this, when the Republicans control all three houses, the White House and both houses of Congress. But if we really are serious about decarbonizing all of society, we need both parties to work together, regardless of who's in the White House, unless you want to try wrecking democracy, which I conjecture won't work too well for us. So I think this is an important topic, regardless of who's in the White House. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some key facts about U.S. political polarization that, in my experience, surprises audience like this, but are useful, I think, for understanding where the common ground is and isn't on climate change. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about our research and other research from other groups that gives me a sense of where I think the common ground is on climate change. And then I'm going to, again, wildly speculate about what we might see in the next 4 years. And you're welcome to, come over to business and throw eggs in my face if I'm wrong. But, such is life. Okay. So first thing that not a lot of people know, most Americans are moderate, especially the disadvantaged. Polarization is a game of the privileged. If you are living on the margins, so what this graph specifically shows is that the extremes on both right and left are disproportionately rich, white, and educated. And the way to think about this intuitively is, if you're on the margins, politics affects your life in a visceral way, right? If people stop prosecuting crime in your neighborhoods, which happened in a lot of cities and caused a lot of cities to shift drastically towards the Republicans in the last election, that matters. Whereas if you're more privileged and politically hobbyist, which is another characteristic that disproportionately applies to the extremes, politics are like a shirt, and you want your shirt to be more colorful and exciting and attention-getting and different than everyone else's shirt. And so your politics are your identity, the way you virtue signal, right? Again, not, I can pick on the far right too, but to pick on the far left, even in the summer of 2020, 80% of Black Americans wanted the same amount of police or more in their neighborhoods, right? It was disproportionately rich white liberals who were saying, get rid of the police. Okay, second, the median voter is economically progressive and socially conservative. Who's heard the saying, oh, the median voter is a fiscal conservative and a social liberal? I used to hear this all the time when I was in Canada, and it's the other way around. Okay. Again, two intuitive ways to think about it. One is, which are you going to like more if you're a lower middle class person? something that helps the material well-being of lower middle class people, or something that enforces the etiquette of people from Harvard, right? Or if you want a more concrete way to think about it, the modal American, right? Just, you know, the median American is a Christian with some college but no college degree, who lives in the suburbs. Is that person a social conservative more likely, or an economic conservative? Okay, if you look at Democrats, a slight majority of them consider themselves moderate or conservative Democrats. Okay, huge majority of Republicans consider themselves conservative. That, or another way to think of it is, if you look at the fringes on the right and left, the groups, fringes defined not normatively just as the groups that separate themselves in terms of their opinions from the rest of Americans and issues. The group on the right, the so-called right wing, is 2 to 3 times as many people as the group on the left, right? So and that means that there's this interesting asymmetry in the sources of power that the two fringes have. So the right fringe has way more power in elected office generally than the left fringe, right? So a funny example from the last couple of years, Jamal Bowman, who's a member of the squad, kind of the far left group in Congress, he lost a Democratic primary in the Bronx to a 70-year-old white guy who called him a racist, right? Try to think about the Republican equivalent of that. It doesn't exist, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the left wing has no power. They have, maybe until the last election, or maybe until Elon Musk bought X, they had enormous power in higher ed, HR departments, big tech, some progressive cities. But still, again, in 2021, at the height of the power of the far left, Seattle elected a Republican DA because they were fed up with crime, right? Again, try to imagine the opposite of that, right? Like Liz Cheney winning in Wyoming. Shoot, this is being recorded. All right. So think about that, those asymmetries both in the power centers, but also where the median voter is. When I show you, I think when I start showing you where specific positions are that have broad support or don't, it'll start to make sense. All right, so another really important aspect of American politics that I'm going to show, mostly climate change related examples of as a segue into climate change, is that we're less divided than we think. So in July 2020, when it seemed like we were as divided as ever, a student of mine and I wrote an op-ed called the 2/3 majority platform. We try to imagine, like, what if you had to run only on things that had 2/3 majority support, what could you run on? And the answer is a lot of stuff, even on the most divisive issues. So just to pick 2 examples, 2/3 or more of Americans support secure borders, more merit-based immigration, and permanent status for the Dreamers. 2/3 of Americans support first trimester abortions and do not support third trimester abortions, right? And I just picked those 2 because they're 2 of our most divisive issues. All right, so let's look at the climate change. One of the things I'll show more directly in a graph in a second is everybody thinks of intuitively of the divide on climate change as being between Republicans and Democrats. In the last 10 years, it's become more between the hard right and everybody else. So for example, these are specific policies. These are kind of general positions about climate change in recent polls. Black is Americans as a whole, and then blue to red are strong Democrats and strong Republicans. You can see that 2/3 support U.S. participation in international efforts to address climate change. So whatever you think of Paris pulling out of it's probably not great politics. And again, the big divide is between moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans. Almost 2/3 support steps to be carbon neutral by 2050. Again, with the big divide between being within the right. One of the things I'll show another example of later on, but as a challenge, is that people do have just like pure partisan tribalism, right? So you could describe, in the context of climate, many of Biden's policies without the word Biden, and people are like, yeah, cool. But he was like, do you like Biden? They're like, no. So that's what you see here. Biden's climate policies are taking the country in the wrong direction. Here there really is the Democrat-Republican divide. Everybody likes tree planting. Everybody likes requiring oil and gas companies to seal methane leaks. Tax credits for businesses for carbon capture. Everybody likes even taxing corporations based on their emissions, and they give majority of Republicans supporting that. Prioritizing alternative energy over fossil fuels, a bit of a partisan divide, but almost 2/3 support overall. Requiring power plants to eliminate carbon emissions by 2040. Yeah, you're getting a little bit divided, but you're still a bit majority. And requiring most new buildings to be run with electricity. Now you're pretty divided. So the point is, it's not that Americans agree on everything climate, but there's quite a lot that that you all agree on climate. I'm Canadian, I should have mentioned. All right, so Americans tend to underestimate support for popular policies and overestimate support for unpopular ones. And we're actually, so let me show an example of what it looks like for climate. This is from a paper, technically just got rejected from PNAS, too bad. The door's open to a crack, so we might be able to spin again. But anyway, we're trying to understand why do people, this is a frequency distribution of people in a survey, how much did they think, what fraction on average do they think Americans support a carbon tax? And this is the distribution of what people guessed. And this is the real number, right? So there's this gap. We underestimate how much people support climate policies. You see this bimodal distribution. This is mostly conservatives. What's interesting about this study is we thought that media bias would explain this misperception, and we didn't find any media bias anymore on average. Obviously there is within specific outlets. So we don't know why it is. My guess is that it has to do with we exaggerate polarization in our minds, and so we think that everybody's like 50-50 split on everything, right? And if you look at these kinds of like misperception studies, people tend to just be biased to 50-50. You're like, who supports I don't know, equal opportunity, which like almost everybody supports, right? People underestimate it, but it's like who supports political violence. Here's another example I'll show. Hardly anybody actually supports political violence, but everybody thinks that like everyone on the other side does. Relatedly, both Democrats and Republicans exaggerate their opponents' positions, underestimate their values, and overestimate their support for bad things. So here's one example of this. The light blue and red estimates are the estimates from the other party, right? So of different types of violence. So Democrats think that almost half of Republicans support violence. Republicans think almost half of Democrats support violence, and this is the fraction that actually support violence. It's like 10%, except for self-defense. People like self-defense, or at least like half people like self-defense. And there's many other kinds of things like that. People sort of, sometimes, particularly in political bubbles, if you live, if you only ever interact with Democrats, you imagine that like every person who's a Republican is like a red hat wearing, angry person. And if you're like a Republican who only hangs with Republicans, you imagine that, every Democrat is like a blue-haired social justice warrior, right? And it's like mostly not the case. When I lived in Boulder, or near Boulder, I met this really interesting person named Claudine Schneider, who in the late 80s was a Republican congresswoman from Rhode Island and led bipartisan climate legislation that had, if you could believe it, both Al Gore and Newt Gingrich as co-sponsors, right? How the hell did that happen, right? The answer is we weren't divided on climate change as a public in the 80s, in the late 80s. When Jim Hansen, famously testified about it, about exactly the same fraction of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents reported being worried about climate change and reported being interested in prioritizing environment protection over economic growth. And then that divide grew, starting in the 90s, it really exploded in the 2000s, and as we'll show in a second, by some margin, by some measures, but not all, has shrunk a little bit in about the last 10 years. Not really this measure though. Oh, sorry. And then, yes, this divide is greatest in English-speaking countries. And the most convincing explanation of why that is I've seen, or I should say among rich countries, is from Smith and Mayer, where they found that basically conservative ideology in English-speaking countries has more of a libertarian streak than it does in non-English speaking countries. And the idea that we have a big market failure, which Econ 101 says the government's going to do something about, is more naturally clashes with libertarian worldviews. Again, the Democrat-Republican difference, I think, masks the more interesting pattern. So this is somewhat very worried about climate change, similar data to what was shown in the previous slide. And again, in about the last 10 years, you kind of have this divide growing between moderate Republicans, independents, and Democrats, and conservative Republicans. Okay, remember how I said that conservative Republicans are a much more dominant faction in Republican primaries than kind of liberal Democrats are in Democrat primaries? What happens with climate change is Republican politicians are in a little bit of a double bind, right? Because in primaries, you really want these people to be happy because they're a big fraction of the party and they're a higher propensity primary voters. But in the general, you want the other people to be happy, right? So there were a few pundits after this last presidential election, including some who I generally think very highly of, who were saying things like, climate is the problem for the Democrats. Climate, the climate cost them the election. No, it didn't. If you had an election on should we do climate change, something about climate change, or should we do nothing about climate change would win in a landslide, right? So there's the estimated fraction of adults in each state who think the president should do more to address global warming. That would be a crushing electoral college victory for the yes side, which majorities are in orange and no majorities are in blue, right? The congressional map would be even more dramatic. The fraction of adults who think Congress should do more to address global warming, that would be a big congressional Senate victory, right? Okay. Funny story. Like 3 years ago, I had some papers come out about how the scenario RCP 8.5 isn't very realistic and we should stop using it, and it assumes some weird things. And somebody from the Heartland Institute wrote that I was a brave truth teller and thank you for calling bullshit on catastrophism. And then we published this study in January that estimated that climate denial might have cost Trump the 2020 presidential election, all else equal, because there's a huge correlation between how important you think climate change is and voting for Biden, to the point where if you're a Republican who thinks climate change is very important, about a quarter of you voted for Biden in 2020. The same blogger from the Heartland Institute wrote a thing about how I was a Democratic Party shill. And I had a lot of fun pointing out that she had previously called me a brave truth teller. It shows that science and politics mix like oil and water. Anyway, the point being, do nothing is not a popular position in general elections, and it's hurt Republicans. And I think many Republicans, if not most Republicans, understand that, although there's definitely been some variance in the last couple of weeks. Now, that doesn't mean that everything the Democrats do on climate change is popular, right? So and I'll talk about some of these things in more detail in terms of studies that we've done. But most Americans don't want to ban fossil fuels or fracking, and some of Kamala Harris's statements about that in the 2020 primary came back to hurt her. So this is just an example from a recent Pew poll. Should we phase out fossil fuels or should we use a mix of both? More than 2/3 want a mix of both. About half of the people who want a mix of both want to eventually get off carbon, but it's basically in that eventually category. There's a heck of a lot of people who don't want to get off of it until we can do so without raising our energy prices, right? Median voter is an economic progressive and a social conservative. Probably one of the worst things the climate movement did to its popularity is go woke in the last 5 years. So we have studies that will talk about that's shown that identity-centered social justice elements have cost climate policies support among legislatures and also among voters. This is a little bit more conjecture, admittedly. I have this law review paper where I lay out the case. Hannah Ritchie has a good book where she describes, she's the Our World in Data environment lead. She describes her own experience with this as an environmental studies student. But I think that climate catastrophism, in addition to, at least in some forms, being, I think, significantly out of step with science, is probably contributing to the youth mental health crisis. And I think it's hurting the credibility of climate advocates. So one example, in some cases. So one example, when it looked like Joe Manchin might block the Inflation Reduction Act from passing, John Podesta, who was, worked for Obama, was the Center for American Progress guy, he said to the New York Times, I think it's odd that Joe Manchin would choose as his legacy to be the one man who single-handedly doomed humanity. I'm sorry, but like, Inflation Reduction Act, ambitious bill, right? But if you really think that's the difference between humanity living and dying in a country that produces 13% of global emissions, that's crazy, right? And it's not serious. And if you talk like that, the average person is not going to take you seriously. You also have to meet people where they are. I was giving a presentation on this stuff to kind of a quite left advocacy group last spring. In the Q&A, someone asked me, what do I do about fossil fuel companies spreading misinformation in my community? I said, well, what are they saying in your community? It's like, well, they're saying that natural gas creates jobs in Colorado and it's relatively clean compared to other countries' natural gas. And it's been offsetting coal, which is reducing emissions. Well, all that's true, right? Now, you can still, if you want, make a case that we should get off natural gas, we don't want to lock in infrastructure, whatever. There's lots of intelligent arguments about what the future of fracking is and what role it plays in the transition. But if you go to a place where the people there, another example, I went to the Western Slope last year at Grand Junction, which is where Lauren Boebert used to be the representative. And one of the community leaders there said to me, people on the Front Range who are richer than us, which is true, vote for governments that restrict our ability to develop our shale resource, which is one of the biggest in the world, which is also true. And if we developed it, we might have a better, economic outlook than we do now. And they're doing this thing to us, and they're making us take wolves. Right? Okay, what do you think would have happened if I was like, boss, that's just Shell's just spreading information. That's the only reason you believe that. Let me educate you. Right? Like, okay, like a Boulder, you know what I mean? Like environmental studies graduates from Boulder, like you're done if you talk down to people like that. So I would urge that we shouldn't do that. Okay, where have we seen some bipartisanship? So Renee Marshall, who was an amazing undergraduate student of mine, if you can believe it, now is a PhD student at Santa Barbara. She looked at every single state legislature from 2015 to 2020 and looked to see where have decarbonization bills passed. And I say decarbonization bills mean bills that have the explicit intent or a clear likely effect of reducing emissions. We're not including bills like the one in Ohio that's like, let's stop doing this climate stuff, right? Okay, of those bills, we found that about a third were bipartisan and about 30% were passed by governments that Republicans controlled 2 out of the 3, the 2 houses in the governor's mission. We did a statistical analysis of, what are these bills, the bipartisan ones look like. On average, they disproportionately use what we call the expanded choice, basically carrots. We're going to help you do renewables. We're not going to ban, some kind of fossil fuel infrastructure. They use financial incentives, and they were slightly more likely to be bipartisan if they had inequality elements focused on class, and much less likely to be bipartisan if they had social justice elements focused on race and gender or disability. We looked at any immutable characteristic. It was almost always one of those 3. again, median voters, economic liberals, open conservative. There's been more federal bipartisan cooperation than I think people realize. I realize that clock is broken, so I'm just gonna go. Like, man, it's like still 7:45. So there's bipartisan solutions caucuses in the House and the Senate that include explicitly climate initiatives as part of their caucus. In 2021, partly at the urging of a group of young Republican climate activists called the American Conservation Coalition, because young Republicans look more like moderate Republicans and Democrats on this issue. John Curtis, who then was in the House, now is the senator from Utah who replaced Romney, started the Conservative Climate Caucus, which is one of the biggest caucuses in the House of Representatives now. And again, you've got, I think, a 3 or 4 seat majority in the Senate, and one of them is now John Curtis, who's a relatively climate conscious Republican. There was climate spending in the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law and the COVID relief bill. There was at least one of the COVID relief bills had climate spending in it and was signed by Trump. The first time. The CHIPS and Science Act was bipartisan, has a lot of clean energy R&D stuff in it. And there's a bipartisan permitting reform bill that's led by our Senator Barrasso and Manchin, which is under consideration. There's also been some smaller bills on things like ag, climate, I think the Climate Solutions Act that passed. That was bipartisan. So there's some bipartisan areas emerging. There's also, I would say, areas emerging where the idea of transitioning fast gels with naturally conservative instincts in ways that maybe it didn't before in the 90s. We were talking about renewables were expensive. We probably need a huge carbon tax to make more progress, right? So for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, a huge majority of the projected benefits of it for emissions in the US go away if you don't expand the rate at which you build power lines. And if you look at how long, this is like a year ago, May, I think we were looking at this. The median was about 7 years to get a federal permit for an interstate power line, right? Even longer for utility scale solar. So if you want to reduce your emissions significantly in 10 years, you're not going to have any shovels in the ground if you don't fix that. Similarly, this is one of the most amazing pieces of data I've ever seen. It comes from this Goolsbee and Siverson paper. This is productivity in the American economy compared to 1950 and productivity in the construction sector. We are less productive in construction than we were in 1950. Okay, and we're talking about building to decarbonize our whole economy. Right? My favorite / most infuriating example of this is in California, the French train company, SNCF, that's makes the famous French trains, came in to help California build high-speed rail. And then a few years later, they left because they're like, we can't work with these people because we can't get them to agree that the most important priority in high-speed rail is moving people from LA to San Francisco. What? I mean, is it an emergency or not? Right? I think is kind of the question that people ask, and the idea that we need to cut tape if we're serious about doing red tape, just about doing fast, gels with a lot of Republican instincts that we have too much waste and too much regulation in the government. Okay, a couple of challenges that I think, despite the public consensus, we have a lot of these issues. Can get in our way. One is this what psychologists call negativity bias, and basically the basic idea of negativity bias is that people respond more strongly to what they dislike than what they like. So just as a thought exercise, raise your hand if you would support a presidential candidate who both wants open borders and a total ban on abortion. Anybody? Right? No. The reason is, well, first of all, many people don't want either of these things. But most people who want open borders are even more upset about the idea of banning abortion than they are excited about open borders. And most people who are excited about banning abortion are even more upset about opening the border, right? And so you've got this challenge for coalitions that people are if you're trying to build coalitions around multiple, complex issues, every time you add something new, you're going to often lose more people than you gain because people are more react strongly to negative things. So an example where we saw this is this study again led by Renee Marshall, where we were looking at what happens when you pair climate policies with other policies. And we were doing this study around the time when some people, like the Citizens Climate Lobby, were talking about, oh, we need to pair, cutting regulations with a carbon tax to bring Republicans on board. And a lot of people on the left were talking about climate in people like Ezra Klein called the omni cause, right? You can only address climate if you also address social justice and this and that and the other thing. And so we just want to look like, what does that do to coalitions, like both of those things. So we asked people about their support for a bunch of different climate policies, either alone or paired with pausing new EPA regulations, tech and infrastructure, which we thought would sort of have broad appeal, economic progressivism, which was one of, tax on the rich, basic income, fund public services, or unionize clean energy jobs, or social justice, which was basically we wanted it to be one of explicit non-neutrality with respect to race and gender, or jargon that sounds like it comes from the sociology department. So we're going to study it. We created an equity commission to study the impacts of policies on marginalized groups. Was one of them. We're going to give 25% of new contracts for energy to women and minority-owned businesses was one. And then we're going to do a commission to study the effects of policies on women and minorities and make recommendations to remedy those. That was sort of vague effects, but explicit non-neutrality. And again, we split these two because the median voter is an economic progressive and social conservative. And there was previous studies that basically did this one and then said that it was both, right? From Leah Stokes' group. And so we wanted to see if people treated them differently because we expected that they would. And what we found was basically negativity bias. Pairing never increased support and sometimes decreased support. So if you paired climate with reducing or pausing regulations to bring the conservatives in, conservatives didn't move and you lost the moderates and the liberals, they went down. If you paired it with social justice to bring the very liberals in, they didn't really move, the moderates and the conservatives went down. And then if you do economic progressivism, maybe there's a slight increase among liberals without a cost to conservatives. That's what Leah Stokes' group found in a different study that looked at these kinds of things. So maybe that one works. It wasn't significant in our study. And infrastructure basically does nothing. Climate alone or climate versus infrastructure, people are like, it's the same. And of course, liberals support all of these more than conservatives because they're all climate. All right. Another example of negativity bias. So it started with this study, it's probably hard to read, but we were trying to look at individual behaviors that households can take to reduce their emissions. Which ones are polarizing? Like which ones do liberals have more stronger intent to do than conservatives? And our hypothesis was like some like electric vehicles might be polarizing, but like weatherizing your house, that's just something you do, right? That's not like a political thing. And sure enough, we found that choose an electric vehicle the next time you buy a vehicle was the single most polarizing. This is the one where the liberals had the largest difference relative to conservatives. And so this is like summer of 2023. Elon had just bought X not that long ago and was saying some stuff that maybe suggested a certain political orientation. And I thought, what if we ran this again and asked half the people about their intentions to buy Teslas? And not being a good student of negativity bias like I am now, I was like, maybe Elon has really brought conservatives along to the electric vehicles movement. No, he made liberals hate Teslas as much as conservatives hate electric vehicles. Sorry, that's this one. And he didn't move conservatives at all. And then we submitted it to a journal and got rejected, and we realized we didn't actually test if it's because of him. So we did it again. And then after we asked them about what they wanted to buy, we asked them if they liked Elon. And we found that liberals and moderates who dislike Elon strongly prefer generic EVs to Teslas, whereas conservatives and liberals who like Elon don't care. So the point being, it's Elon. Now, I imagine liberals sort of find that amusing in a Schadenfreude kind of way, like, oh, he's wrecking his car company, right? But I think there's also kind of a less charitable interpretation of this for liberals, like, you guys think climate change is an emergency or not? Like, intemperate tweets maybe don't matter if it's an emergency. Interpret it how you will. All right, partisanship is another challenge. I showed you the thing about how people, on the moderate conservatives like a lot of generically stated policies that Biden supported, but if you ask them if they like Biden's policies, they're like, no, I don't like it. That turns out to go both ways. So this is a study by my former colleague Lisa and Bovin et al., where they looked at for cap and trade policy and carbon tax policy, how much did Republicans and Democrats and independents support it, depending on who they thought proposed it. So blue is they think the Democrats are proposing it, red is Republicans, but it's the same policy, right? So if there's no partisanship, it shouldn't matter who proposed it. But of course, it matters a lot. Democrats decrease their support for cap and trade by half if they think the Republicans are proposing it. Republicans have, a slightly smaller but similar effect kind of going the other way. So again, there's just this pure partisanship effect where partly you're trying to get people to agree on policies and facts and positions, and partly it's just like, I don't like it because the orange guy is doing it, or I don't like it because Kamala is doing it, right? And that's, just probably something that's never going to change. All right. So some of these things I've talked about, some of these things I've glossed over a little bit, and happy to follow up with other research behind this. But if you sort of ask me to characterize broadly, what does a big tent approach to climate change look like? That could kind of get 2/3 or more of the American public on board. I think today it's all of the above energy. Maybe as technology continues to improve, it'll be more hawkish than that. But I think that today that's where we are. Meaning kind of support everything. An example of Republicans running with success on this. The 4th most popular governor in the country is Mark Gordon from Wyoming, which is the single most anti-climate policy by public state in the country, the single most pro-Trump state in the country. And he says this, he's called climate change publicly an urgent issue. Carrots over sticks, focus on class and kitchen table issues rather than identity, optimism over pessimism. By the way, you can still recognize environmental injustice if you do this, right? If you say we're gonna help the communities that are most polluted and the communities that are poorest, those communities if those characteristics are correlated with race, you're gonna disproportionately help disadvantaged racial groups. As one example. Optimism over pessimism. There are studies by people like Jay Van Bavel that find that pessimism, I personally wish it was the case that pessimism never worked, because I just don't like it. That's not true, but it is true that pessimistic frames make people want to do things like throw soup and post angrily on social media. They don't make people want to build things. And so I would argue that we should prefer to do the latter. Plus, throwing soup, there's actually studies that literally show that turns people off climate activists. Shocking. Blocking traffic is the same. Plain spoken discourse over hyperbole and histrionics, right? If you talk like John Podesta did in that New York Times example, people who don't already agree with you are just gonna shut you out and think that you're being performative and unserious, or other worse adjectives. And then national pride over national shame. I want to dwell on this a little bit. I haven't done direct research on this yet. I think I saw one paper that showed this, but I would say it's a pretty strong hypothesis, because there's a ton of work in econ and political science that suggests that having a shared identity is a strong predictor of public goods provisioning, right? If you go around and say, and I think this works both internally and externally. If we go around and say, our country sucks, we're the most rapacious, oppressive country ever. Oh, other countries, you should follow us into the climate sunset, right? Other countries are like, why? And also we say, our country's horrible, our government's never done anything right. You should give our government a bunch of money to help with this issue. You're like, why, right? Or if you care about inequality, right? we're all different groups, we'll never understand each other. But we should raise our taxes for this group to help this group. It doesn't make any sense. I would say common sense dictates that we invest in groups we're invested in. And if I'm right in suspecting that having a patriotic, can-do, pro-American frame is important, I suspect that's a big blind spot for climate activists, because there's a negative correlation between how much you care about climate change and how proud you are to be American. I'm the proudest Canadian to be American ever. 2 more years. Hopefully, it's when I'm planning to naturalize. All right, so again, after the election, a bunch of media outlets were asking me, what does this mean for climate change? And so at some point I decided I'm just gonna write it down, what I think, and then I have it open when I'm on these Zoom calls. And so I put this on my Substack, which is called Guided Civic Revival, and basically here's my guess. Expect a big change in rhetoric. I think that's pretty safe bet. Already going to take the W on that one. Expect some change in policy. Again, I think I'll take the W on that one already. But here's where I'm sticking my neck out. I think there's going to be not that much change in the path of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Again, come over to the College of Business and throw egg in my face. 4 years from now, I turn to be wrong. All right, here's why I think that. So let's just look at the big picture. This is U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. There's pretty consistent linear, 1.1% decline per year across the last 4 presidents, including Trump 1. Then these projections, this is the sort of the election projections from Carbon Brief, which is a big climate group. So this is based on a model of all of Biden's policies working perfectly. Okay, so everyone uptakes the money rolls out exactly as it's supposed to. The markets clear perfectly. There's no transaction costs. There's no frictions. We build tons of power lines, et cetera, et cetera. This is if Trump eliminates every single one of Biden's policies, including the Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, this is Biden's policies work perfectly, except we don't build power lines faster. Right? So if you assume these models are right, which is, it could be wrong. If you assume these models are right, I would almost think of this as not that far off of the best case scenario, and this is not that far off from the worst case scenario, and squint and spot the difference. Right? And it looks a lot like continuing the trend that we're on. This is clean energy investment across Trump 1 and Biden. The IRA and the CHIPS Act did something, right? There is a noticeable increase in the second half of the Biden term, and it's more clear in kind of other measures. But again, it was already going up in the Trump term, right? Why? Economics. A lot of the levers driving these things are not in the White House, right? Okay, and then same thing, if we look at oil, gas, and coal, Obama, Trump, and Biden's terms were all good for oil and gas and bad for coal. And again, that almost entirely has to do with forces outside the White House, which are not expected to change much anytime soon. So, if I had to guess, US emissions will decline by about 1.1% a year. Clean energy investment will go up. Oil and gas production will go up a little bit, maybe not as much as people think. Coal will go down. All right, much of the action is in the private sector. By the way, this wasn't always true. It's not saying that climate change policy is useless. It's certainly, the public subsidies and investments and market signals sent by regulations and international agreements and things, over the last 20 years, sent strong signals that got a lot of private investment into renewables, into EVs, including our friend Elon, who, Lumberham, I think, has done more than any other individual to advance decarbonization technology. But we're at a point now where this is a paper that I published with another former student of mine, Grace Krager, where we found basically that each of these states that's purple or blue is a state where the utilities are more ambitious than the state governments for decarbonization. And that's, red is the one where the states are more ambitious, and whites are the ones where there's no state policy, but even them, their utilities are planning, are promising to decarbonize, right? And some of that has to do with markets. Texas is the biggest producer of renewables in the US by state. Some of that is interstate market signals, right? So there's a debate right now in Wyoming about should we take off our requirement for carbon scrubbers on coal plants. And we export, I think, like 90% or more of our coal, largely to states that want us to have scrubbers, right? So it might actually hurt our coal producers because of these, if we took that requirement away in a weird way because of these markets. And same thing, you have utilities, you know, in some states with no policies, where these same utilities serving other states that do have policies, right? And so they're just going with it, right? Plus there's global markets. So a lot of the action is in the private sector. Again, Texas and Georgia, two of the leaders in, you know, nationally in renewable energy. That's both a market thing. It's also a political thing, right? If the new administration decides they want to not just, you know, expand oil and gas, which love it or hate it is popular, they decide they want to tamp down on solar and wind, you're gonna have some angry people in Texas being like, don't do that, right? Other things is Biden's climate policies, you know, not all aspects of them are popular, right? They certainly, for example, have some identity-based social justice aspects that aren't popular. But this is real private fixed investment in manufacturing. Now, this isn't all the climate stuff, it's also the infrastructure stuff, it's also the private sector, but there's been a huge increase in domestic manufacturing on Biden's watch, and Biden's policies had something to do with that. And that's something that you know, credit where it's due, reshoring manufacturing, Trump was the one who put that on the public conversations radar in his first term, right, in the primaries. So is he really gonna, you know, make that go away? And will his Congress let it? Most of the spending from the Inflation Reduction Act and other clean energy policies goes to red districts, because that's where you build solar and wind, right, in rural areas. The answer's on the slide. But I have a version of this where you can't see the name here. You know, the district in the whole country, the second most planned and operational renewable capacity is represented in Congress by Kevin McCarthy, who used to be the speaker, right, the Republican Speaker of the House. So again, is the IRA going to be fully repealed in a super narrow Congress where a lot of this money goes away? Anyone who's telling you they know what's going to happen is selling you something, but my money is on no. There's even been reporting about how behind the scenes there have been quite a few Republicans who were trying to push President Trump to be more moderate on climate, basically recognizing both these economic issues I talked about and the electoral problem that, you know, do nothing poses, as opposed to kind of all of the above, you know, America first, American energy, you know, kind of approach that's more popular, you know, while still kind of Republican branded. John Curtis said to this Politico, "We're not dependent on a standard bearer outside of the House." Okay, and we have real historical examples of what this looks like. So who's heard of Ceres here? So I was introduced as being formerly from Ceres, and because you're atmospheric scientists, right? Most people are like, what the hell is Ceres? Okay, so Ceres is a big federally funded through NOAA's OAR, Office of Atmospheric Research, place that employs like 800 people, right? So if federal climate science funding goes away, that's a big effing problem for places like Ceres, right? So every year when Trump was in office the first time, when I was in Ceres, our director would say, here's the White House budget request. It cuts like half of OAR's budget in some cases, but then he would always say, don't worry, we have more friends in Congress than people realize, including we had a very pro-climate science Republican senator in Cory Garner at the time. You know, I don't think this will show up in the appropriation. And he was right. This is the appropriation steadily went up for climate science funding during Trump's first term. This is organized by fiscal year. That's why it's offset a little bit, right? Because you passed the fiscal year before. It actually came down a little bit under Biden because of competition with space spending. So again, anybody who says they know what's going to happen is selling you something, but my best guess would be that climate science funding this term is going to look a lot like this. I think you're going to see pretty big cuts from the White House budget request, but federal science, particularly physical science, has pretty strong support among the rank and file in Congress, particularly in a narrow Congress. I think whatever you think about the ban on aid and grants that or pause or whatever that just came out in the last couple of days, I think it's going to force the courts to figure out where Congress's powers of the purse start and stop, which actually might make these conversations smoother. But I could be wrong. All right, latest developments I'm watching. Freeze on federal grant disbursements. The scope is a little bit unclear. I watched the White House press secretary today, and it sounded like part of it was trying to parse the stuff, the DEI stuff that was sort of where the argument they're making is not that they have the ability to override Congress, it's that they're enforcing civil rights law. And in some cases, I think they actually have a leg to stand on there. Okay, but so the point is, it might be a narrow scope, or it's a broad scope. But if it's a broad scope, I think it's pretty likely that you're going to see successful court challenges under the separation of powers and Congress's control of the purse. So again, I'm selling you something, right? I might be wrong, but my best guess is that this memo is going to be very disruptive for the next month or so, and then the courts and or new memos will sort it out, and it'll be still very disruptive for some areas, but kind of not writ large. Okay, the other thing that I have to say surprised me a little bit was, you know, the tone in the campaign, including from Trump, was much more all of the above. If you look at who you pointed, Burgum, Wright, Zeldin, all of the above, except the science of climate people. So I have to admit, I was a little surprised by this. Executive orders targeting new wind and solar and offshore and on federal lands. So is that going to change my conclusion? I would say cautiously, tentatively, no. If you look at how much of current utility scale renewable energy on federal land, it's only about 4%, and the economics are super good in the private sector now, where it's very competitive on cost. And so, you know, is this going to change the macro trends in terms of solar and wind growth? I guess it's probably not. Offshore wind is currently only about 1% of U.S. wind production. Now, there's lots of potential areas for offshore wind. So maybe if this policy kind of continues throughout this administration and beyond, you might see some kind of long-term effects on growth in wind. But again, my guess is even if Republicans in Congress don't sort of soften this a little bit, which I think is quite possible, I don't think it's as big of a hit to the solar and wind industries as people think. And again, things like if they wanted to stop spending from the Inflation Reduction Act and other congressional appropriations, I think they're going to run into problems in the courts. Okay, so in summary, I think we need to work together to address climate change, no matter who's in the White House. I think there's a track record of some opportunities and incentives to work together. The private sector is making a ton of progress and in many areas leading, which I think improves the politics of it. I think both parties actually have a pretty strong political incentive to work together in this issue. For Republicans, if they don't take it seriously, they're going to lose elections. It's not always the most important issue, but it's definitely a losing issue for them still. And for Democrats, I would say, if you want people to believe that you believe your own rhetoric about it being an emergency and an existential threat, then you gotta be willing to make compromises. Otherwise, you don't really think it's an emergency. And I think the kinds of compromises that probably are going to be made is shedding some of the extreme posturing and the identity politics. And if I had to guess, current trends that will probably continue for the next 4 years are reductions on average in US greenhouse gas emissions, declines in coal, and increases in oil and gas. Okay, parting thoughts. I would like to say to my conservative friends, you want to make America great? What would make America greater than leading this new frontier in technology that's going to come whether we like it or not? And if we do it first, we get to export it to everybody, right? I think that would be pretty great. Liberal friends, again, if climate change is really an emergency, act like you believe that, and show that you're willing to collaborate. And I would say to everybody, climate change is a major challenge, polarization is a major challenge, but if you look at almost every measure of well-being, this is one of the best societies that's ever existed. Not only that, if you look at the things about America that are the worst, like our biggest flaws, you find them everywhere else in history, in time and space, and they're almost always worse than they are here now. And if you look at our biggest strengths, you find them almost nowhere else in history, in time and space. And so I would say, both intellectually, ethically, and scientifically, focusing on that optimism is good, and it's going to help us get it done if we act like we believe in ourselves. Thank you.